Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Troy, this is Alex. We are the primary open source database tools maintainers at Box. So we wanted to give a presentation about some of the stuff we've learned going through the open source process, whether it's tools we've already had in the open source community, or if it's something new that we are starting off. So for those who don't know, I wanted to put up a About Box slide. So those of you who want to know more about Box, Box is the cloud content management company that empowers enterprises to revolutionize how they work by securely connecting their people, information, and applications. Learn more at www.box.com. All right. The clicker does not work well, so we might have to lean over and manually click it. Again, I am Troy Karraker. I am based out of Phoenix, Arizona. I joined Box in 2015. There I have the role of senior database engineer. I started in MySQL in 2011. I started with some general sysadmin work, moved to MySQL, and here I am.
Hi, I'm Alex. I also work for databases team at Box. I don't know what to talk about me.
Well, you used to work at Percona,
Yeah.
2008, 2014.
Nice.
So there we go. There's Alex. All right, so our objective for this talk. Most of us work with a lot of code. Our primary job challenges are writing code, making sure code works, and ultimately using that code to make our lives and the lives of our coworkers easier. The goal for this talk is we want everybody to realize that open sourcing your tools makes everyone's lives easier, and you should totally do it. So, our agenda for today. We're going to go over our existing open source tools for those who aren't familiar with what we already have out there. Then we are going to talk about the benefits of open sourcing a project. Admin one. And then we are going to go over kind of the process of open sourcing a project with story time. This is where a lot of the anecdotes about Box and the challenges we've faced are going to come in, as if we are going through and starting a new project and open sourcing it. And then finally, we're going to have a little section about what's next for Box open source, what we want to do, in the coming year, 2 years, what have you, beyond what we've already done. And then finally, we have a section for Q&A. If anybody has any questions for anything we talked about, anything we didn't talk about related to Box, Box open source in general, us, go for it. We'll do that at the end. So, first off, our open source software. So the most well-known of the Box open source tools in terms of stars, forks, pretty much everything in GitHub is Anemometer. It is a tool used to analyze the results of
PT Query Digest.
PT Query Digest, thank you. It was open source back in 2012. It has been stable for about a year now. We haven't done a lot of work on it. We'll touch on why that is later on in the presentation. But ultimately, we are doing some work here and there, but we are always looking for more people to provide any sort of, features, bug fixes, whatever you can think of. We're always open. Second, we have RainGauge, which is a front end for PT stock information. It was also open source in 2012, also stable. Very little work is being done directly on this tool. We can touch a little bit more on the what's next section, but it works. I highly recommend people use it. It is a fantastic tool for knowing, when your server stalls, you can get all sorts of information about what happened because of PT stock. And then finally, our newest of the new, we have etcdb. It is Alex's baby, so he's going to talk a little bit about it, and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, the story behind etcdb was we wanted to build Django applications for one of our internal projects, and we wanted to use etcd as a backend for Django. And unfortunately, Django supports only PEP 249 compatible backends, which etcdb is not. etcd is not. So etcdb actually implements the standard to access etcd as it were like MySQL-like database, and we open source it.
Alrighty, moving on to the benefits of open source. I like to think that there are three major benefits to open sourcing a project, or three categories of benefits. You have the benefits you're going to find to the industry as a whole, you know, a project being better than the sum of its parts, everybody rallying behind a single set of tools that we can make better, things of that nature. Then we have the benefits to your specific company and why you should try and convince your management to allow you to open source, or convince security, or whoever you have to convince to do open source. And then we have the benefits to you, the individual contributor who's working on the code. So benefits to the industry, I think we can all agree, is pretty straightforward. You know, when we can all rally behind a single tool, you know, it makes a lot of things just easier to work with. So we're going to touch more on the benefits to company and the benefits to individual. So benefits to company. We're going to start with our first story of the presentation, and that was back actually when I worked at my former employer. We had an absolutely gnarly outage due to developers releasing just really bad SQL into the environment, that when running in a development environment, it worked fine. But then once they deployed it and ran it in production, and then production scale hit, it just completely destroyed all of the shards, and everybody just crashed and just bad. Well, after this outage, the first thing we did was we all powwowed to try and figure out where do we go from here to make sure this doesn't happen again. So I don't remember who brought it up, but somebody suggested that we use anemometer in our development environment and possibly production in the future, but ultimately to use that in the release pipeline. So that way, when developers are writing code, that information gets processed, sent to anemometer, and we can look at things from the performance of that query. So we can raise red flags and give that to the developers before the code releases into production and just starts wreaking havoc. So this worked out really well from a problem-solving standpoint, but because of that, this is the first time that I had heard not only of Box open source, but Box as a company as a whole. So it kind of solidified that mental idea that Box is a company that can solve my problems. And that is fantastic when it comes to the company's positive image and branding. And then now, because I had heard of Box and I'm potentially interested in learning more about the product itself, the company can now consider me a possible sales, lead. And I can now enter that pipeline, and they can try and sell me the actual Box product because of a problem that was solved using something that Box produced. Then following this, about a year later, was the first time I had attended this conference. And Box was giving, I think, 4 talks at the time, and I made sure to attend each one of them because I was so intrigued by the products that they'd created from a tech ops standpoint that I wanted to see what they had going. And because of this, I realized that was cool. I realized that Box not only had an awesome product, but it was a place that I wanted to work. And I think it was something like 3 or 4 years later that actually ended up happening. But because of these tools that were available, it put that idea in my mind. So it gives you access to a pipeline of new hires. Finally, and one of the things that the management types will recognize is the fact that when you have code that's public, anybody can contribute to it. So you have a lot of productivity that you're not paying for. Like, how often do you hear a line, well, yeah, we really want to make that better, but we've got this project and that project, and we're working on all these different things. We simply don't have the time. Well, if your code is open source and there is a feature that is really beneficial to that product, then anybody who is using that can then create a feature branch, and they can submit it, and the product is now better because of it. So here we have kind of our 4 big benefits to a company. These are obviously by no means exhaustive, but they're a good place to start to try and understand kind of why a company would benefit to open sourcing a product. So finally, we have the benefits to you, the individual contributor. So you might be thinking, well, that's great, sales and free productivity and all of that, but my company's a private company, and frankly, my owner, she makes way too much money. I don't really care if the business makes any more money. What's in it for me? Well, all of us have heard over our time in working in tech is that if you commit to GitHub publicly, you have a roaming resume and everything looks great, and recruiters will be banging down your door, and yeah, if a recruiter saw somebody's heat map come across and say, this is what I do out in the world, you're getting a leg up because they know that you are contributing. So, resume builder, it's obvious, most of us already know that that's going to happen. However, there are some things that are secondary that are just as important. And that is the idea of skill growth. Obviously, most of us have, if you have the idea that you've worked with a person or a group of people for a long time, you have that idea of how different people code and their style, and you will eventually pick up on different things that they do. Now, if you're working on an open source product, you obviously have your coworkers, but then anybody else that's in that project is now going to submit code to the project that you can review. So whether or not you are the code reviewer or the code being reviewed, you have situations where you might be doing something that somebody can come along and say, hey, this isn't the ideal way to do this, you can do something else. Or perhaps if you are, perhaps the code reviewer was actually the one writing the code, and then you look at it and you see, oh, I didn't realize I can do that, that is awesome. Well, you're now a better engineer because you saw that code. So, code reviews, skill growth. Finally, one of the other nice benefits, we're going to lead to another story here. So in that first Percona Live conference that I went to, I knew nobody. It was the first company that I had worked for in a technical role, in a highly technical role. And so I didn't meet anybody in the industry. And so when I arrived at the conference, I basically followed my coworkers around like a lost puppy. I was nowhere near as cool as Wilfred, but alas, that was me. I'm just walking around, and I have to rely on all of my coworkers to say, oh, hey, yes, this is Baron. Oh, Baron, yeah, I know Baron. So alas, networking is one of those other kind of the unsung heroes of committing to open source, because you have a shoe in the door, a talking point that you can bring up to say, yes, I worked on that project too. Cool, let's share war stories, because you get enough technical people together in a room for more than 10 minutes, and the first thing that happens is everybody starts talking about war stories and nasty outages and all that fun stuff. So hopefully I have convinced everybody listening that open source is awesome, and now you want to go forth and actually start releasing code. So we're going to touch on how to open source. I will go ahead and get started, and then I'll hand over to Alex, and he can go a little further. But so the first thing we want to do is understand that there are mental hurdles and mindset changes necessary to wanting to release code. A lot of times when I'm talking to somebody who is working on a project and I ask, oh, cool, is that going to be open source? The answer sometimes is, probably not. Why not? Well, it's really small. It's just for a one-off thing. I don't really want to open source it. Well, ultimately, nothing is too small when it comes to open source. And there's one fundamental reason for this. When you release something into the open source community and it takes off, and what is doing that? When you release something into the open source community and it takes off and people start contributing to it, it allows the people who are working on the big open source projects, whether it's Schema, Ghost, Orchestrator, all the PT toolset items, the big projects, it allows them to not have to worry about freeing up, not having to worry about doing the same thing you're doing. They can focus more on their project. So ultimately, it allows the other open source tools to be better because they're no longer having to, write a small Python module or 100 lines of bash or whatever it is. If you're solving a problem, it allows other people to not have to worry about those same problems. So now we've decided that we have a project and we want to run with it. Well, some of the first things that we want to do is there are some other non-code things that we want to tackle. Releasing code into the world, you can cowboy your open source incredibly easily. You can just go out and say, here's some code, throw it on GitHub, walk away, and hope it takes off and goes. Well, ultimately, there are two things you want to do before you truly get started. And obviously, the size of your organization is going to depend on how possible this actually is. But the first thing you want to do is speak to any branding people you have within your organization. If you remember back at the beginning of the talk, I explained the branding benefits of having an open source tool. Well, you want to make sure you're following the coherent story that your company is trying to put forth in branding. Whether that is, we use these logos, we use this, wording related to the company, anything that is going out with your company's name on it, you want to make sure you're following the same rules. Perhaps your company has a rule that, I don't know, all open source tools have to be weather related. I don't know any company that would be that crazy, but it's there. And then also, you'll want to speak to any legal people that you have in your organization. There are lots of different open source licenses that can be used for your tool. If you are putting your company's name on it, you are also opening your company up to respecting the license that you choose. So you want to make sure that that license is the right license. There are people who go to school for these things and they understand them. It's best to leverage them to make sure you are not opening yourself up to problems in the future. And then also, on top of the actual software license, you'll usually want to create some sort of contributor license agreement. That basically gives any contributor on your project the understanding of, this is the way things work with this company, so I know this ahead of time. And if anybody's interested, we have ours available. It's opensource.box.com/CLA. If you try and contribute to any of the Box open source tools, you will be hit by CLA bot saying, hey, you need to make sure you accept the CLA before we can review your pull request. And then any future pull requests, CLA bot will then come back and say, yes, this person has signed, you're good to go. So, I got this one right? Oh, yeah. All right. So, there are two things that you need to answer to yourself once you've gotten the go-ahead with everything else. So now you're actually going to start coding and releasing things into the wild. So there's two questions you want to answer here. Where do I put it, and when do I put it there? The first question is almost a very simple question to answer, and that is, you're going to want to put it on GitHub. GitHub, folks. Because with GitHub, it is the largest repository. 5 stars, show me. So putting it on GitHub, you have the largest exposure to your code base. Most developers who contribute to open source will have a GitHub account. It's easier, it removes a lot of the barriers to entry for somebody to join and start helping you out. The next question of when do you put it there, that one's not as obvious. We go with an it depends model. It depends on a lot of things. However, we argue that as early as possible is a good starting point. And that also can vary from organization to organization. You can say, okay, as early as possible means as soon as I go into Python and I run cookie cutter and I have a skeleton, I'm open sourcing that and I'm going to start coding from day one. That's cool. There are distinct benefits to that. Or you can take the mindset of, I want to wait until I have a functioning proof of concept, then open source, and then have people start working on us. Ultimately, open sourcing as early as possible gives you one distinct benefit, and that is you code with a certain paradigm in mind, and that you are writing it with the open source community in mind. Ultimately, if you build something for your organization and then you try and rip out the business logic at a later date in order to prepare it for open source, that is a pain. We actually ran into this with one of our tools. We developed a backup processor and GUI and things, much in the vein of the anemometers and the rain gauge, that give us an idea of how backups are working in our environment. We decided, hey, this is awesome. We should share it with the world. It solves a lot of problems. And in the summer of 2015, we had an intern that joined, and one of his major summer projects was to prepare our backup tool for the world of open source. So he jumps in, and obviously he's looking for the obvious things like bugs and ripping out the business logic and all of that. And then after a month of digging into it and trying to replace business logic and get it still running by allowing business logic to be passed in from, say, like a config or something like that, he discovered that fundamentally the application does not work. It doesn't allow you a good way to take that business logic out because of a lot of assumptions that are made with the code. It is specifically built to Box's architecture. With that, you can't open source that because nobody is running Box's architecture except for Box. And then also, by having code out as early as possible, the community can help you find the bugs in your application as you grow. So if you are building the tool and you're running with it, and then this weird corner case that your business doesn't actually use, but is there, has a fundamental problem, somebody else might actually use that feature and discover it doesn't work right, or it just slightly misbehaves. They can file the issues, they can file the bug reports and bug fixes as pull requests without you having to actually do complete end-to-end, top-down, full-on integration tests, because that information is there. And then let's say somebody finds just a gnarly security vulnerability. If you simply change the direction of your application on the fly as you're coding, you can just simply make the changes as you go. That's a lot easier than discovering that you have already built the tool, it's working, and you deploy it, and then you have to completely refactor an entire feature because of a fundamental problem. By having it open in the open source community earlier, you can find a lot of those bugs really early, and you can fix them before they become a problem. So I will now pass off to Alex, who will take on organization and a little bit more of the technical details of the talk.
Yeah. Thank you, Troy. Does it work?
You're good.
Good. So we agreed it's going to be GitHub, right? And for GitHub, we recommend to use Git Flow Model. Git Flow Model, in principle, long time around, and it's proven, and we use it for our open source projects. It's very good, we like it. Here's a link for very detailed description of it, but I will overview it in shorter details. So there are two public branches. Branch which is called master and branch which is called develop. Every revision of master branch is a stable, production-ready release of the product, right? Develop branch is a branch where you do development and where you contribute new features to, and what you base PRs on. So let's say you want to develop new feature. At state 0, you have master and develop exactly the same. And then you fork a new local branch, your local branch, which you called feature 1. And you develop your feature in this branch. And then you push it back to develop. At the same time, other developer develops another feature. There is some cycle, and here we go again, back to develop. So this is Git Flow in short. Actually, it's much more complex model, so you better check that URL. So when develop branch is more or less production ready, so you want to cut a new release, you just merge develop into master, and here we go, new version, new stable version of your product. And because you have two very important branches in GitHub, you have to protect them in GitHub. And this is a screenshot of what GitHub supports at this moment. What I like the most is GitHub now supports code reviews, which is great. GitHub also can block PRs if tests fail it, or it can block PRs from being merged if user didn't sign CLA. This is what we do at Box. And yeah, it's also, I see there is a new feature that you can specify a list of users that can that can push to a branch without PR. This is very useful when you assign a release manager role to somebody, so they can directly push to master branch without a PR. It's very handy to have it. So, oh, you run out of power.
Yeah, I just noticed that.
It's okay.
Yeah, keep going. What's that? Probably wouldn't hurt.
Okay, so for open source project, it's very important to have tests. The reason for that is it gives you great confidence in your code. It gives you great confidence in your code, and you know what your code is doing, and you know that new feature or new code base will not break your existing functionality. And that also means that you can, the development you do is much more robust. Actually, unit tests are very handy even when you start developing some feature or some product, because if you start with tests and you see that, you know, on some reasons it's difficult to test this function or this feature, that's a clear sign that something is wrong with the design, because it should be easy to test, to write the test, small unit test for some small piece of your product. And having no tests, having tests actually allows you to avoid pitfalls that we got into, and that happened because two major contributors to our open source projects, one left company, another one got promoted, and we lost confidence in what the product is doing. We didn't know the code base well, and frankly, it was scary to accept new PRs. And it's embarrassing, but we ended up in this situation. You know, we were working on the project internally, but there was no visibility, there was no dynamics, and we couldn't keep up with PRs our community were sending us. So having tests is good to avoid that. Continuously running tests is very important, because it's not enough to just write tests. You have to make sure somehow that these tests will be run, and you have to include that into your workflow. And this is what Travis CI for. It integrates very well with GitHub, and basically what it can do for you is, like, it can run unit tests. It can run unit tests for different versions of PHP or Python or operating system. It can also run tests inside a Docker container. So that gives you even greater flexibility. You can even run integration tests with Travis. So the next, some pieces of CI/CD Travis can do, and the next part after CI is continuous deployment. You can use Travis for that too. You can build packages with it, And what is quite important when you develop some project for external use is to be able to test it beforehand, because it will give you greater confidence that product is, the next version is good enough, it's not buggy, maybe it doesn't introduce new unexpected bugs and so on. So it's better to start using new release first. And for anemometer, we do that themselves. We build Docker images not from master branch, which is stable release, but we also build Docker image from develop branch, which is unstable version, right? But it also depends on, on your own requirements. Maybe your project is so critical for your business that you cannot afford running unstable version. Yeah, that's also true. And let's not forget that unit tests are not perfect. I mean, it's not enough to just have unit tests. Travis also allows to run some integration tests. But again, if you use the product, it's much better confidence. So yeah, unit tests pass, but you know what happened. And about the release and deployment. I'm a little bit skeptical about open source projects that do not offer you as a user easy way to use this project. So if, in other words, if it's just source code, what I'm gonna do with it? So in my opinion, it's nice to move forward your users and make your product more easier to use for them. And that includes building RPMs for your product, or maybe Debian packages, or whatever else, or maybe just providing spec files so users can use this spec file and maybe do their own company-specific changes. But still, it's much better than just source code. It also applies for Puppet modules and chef recipes, because in real life, like your product or any other product, it doesn't live in an isolated world. It somehow integrates with existing environment and infrastructure. So open source them too, if you can. For sake of convenience, it's nice to tag releases of your product. Git Flow Model, it assumes that, and if you install Git Flow plugin for Git tool, by default it will do that for you. So it will, when you release new version, it will tag the new version with the tag, right? And in principle, you can use that to roll back, or maybe to use it for, I don't know, for automation, or maybe for better control on how you deploy software. Again, I will mention Travis here because it can do some elements of CD part of CI/CD. If build is successful on master branch and all tests are passing, it can also deploy artifacts to repos. For example, you can build Docker image and upload it to Docker Hub. You can upload packages to Package Cloud, or if it's Python module, you can upload them to PyPy. Still, it's so great convenience for your users that can just install package and have your open source software on their systems. And let's talk about what's next.
Alrighty, so one thing that we readily accept and are working towards is the idea that we've kind of let our open source commitment atrophy. And going forward, one of the things we want to work on as an organization, not just database operations, but all of technical operations, including SRE and platform, is kind of getting back to that realm that we were in 2 years ago, where the idea of box open source was fairly well known and well regarded in the industry. So we are going to be actively working on making sure that Anemometer is ready to go. We want some new features in the application. We want to make sure that the code coverage and the tests are solid, so that way there's no blindness to what we are doing or what somebody else wants to do with the application. And this includes adding new features such as, with 5.7 and 8, we want to make sure that they will work both as a collector as well as a backend store. We are currently investigating bugs that that prevent 5.7 from being used as a backend store. But ultimately, we want to make sure that the products all move forward and are positively used by anybody who is interested. And then that allows us to go back to being, thought of as a solid open source contributor. So we will continue working on etcdb. It is the current major project. It is the back end to a very large scale project within the Box Tech Ops organization. Ideally, we would also like to see that the application that is using the etcdb plugin will actually be open sourced itself, assuming we can get that knocked out and out there. So that would be our end goal. Yeah, those are the things we're working on with open source. So that wraps up the actual presentation portion of our talk. Does anybody have any questions for us? Again, anything related to the talk, anything Box open source, Alex and I? Yes? Sure. The question was, are we doing anything to actively promote looking for contributions? So if we have a feature or something that we want, but we don't actually have the time to do it. The answer, not at the moment. Right now, we're still kind of in the idea gathering phase on where we want to go forward with the projects. Obviously, if anybody wants to start tackling the projects towards 5.7 and 8 supporting Anemometer and RainGauge, just validate that it works, and if there's any problems, file the issues and we can go that route. And then obviously if you fix the issues and you want to submit a pull request, that would be awesome and we would really appreciate it. But as of right now, no, we're not, since we don't have the idea of where we want to go with it, it's very hard to say, if anybody's interested, we have this feature we'd like to add, please contribute. But yes, great question.
What we are working on right now is on better coverage for Anemometer and RainGauge, because at some point we realized that test coverage is not good enough, so we are in catching up mode. Another thing is we are polishing our pipeline, how we organize development workflow, how we use new versions, how we use Anemometer in containers. So we are working on that, and yeah, we would love to have some feedback from community. Maybe not necessary in PRs, but in general ideas, like what features we should add, or maybe what direction we should take for this or that project. Again, etcdb, we are actively developing it, and we actually open sourced it long before we started using it in production. And yeah, so if you have some interests, have some ideas, we will definitely appreciate it.
Anybody else? Again,
Yes.
to Shlomi.
Another question, so we run a few open source projects, and then sometimes we file an issue for ourselves, and it relates to some internal data, so we don't feel comfortable copying and pasting into the public issue. I don't know, host names or retired transcripts, logs, etc. I'm wondering how do we handle this?
Okay. The question was, if you find an issue and part of it includes a lot of internal business information, how would you go about filing said issue?
I will take it.
Go for it.
So, of course, each case is unique, and it all depends on the situation. The general idea I have in mind is to sanitize that input from the bug description, right? And sanitize basically all sensitive information and convert it somehow into a test case. So then you can write, for bug fixes, it's especially useful to practice test-driven development. So the bug report is almost half-ready test case. So sanitize input, write a unit test for that, and get fix and push back to develop.
Yeah, and I'd like to piggyback off of that, because especially when it comes to sensitive business information like, say, host names, having the repeatable test case with sanitized information is incredibly helpful, because you may run into a situation where, say, your table name is 65 characters and the anemometer column definition truncates you at 64. There are edge cases like that, so being able to provide a repeatable test case or a unit test that could potentially show the problem in the future is incredibly helpful for both yourself and making sure that the issue ticket is robust, but also anybody working on the code base can then repeat it and know if they fixed the issue with the idea that they had. Yes.
I'm curious about your sort of evolving over time the way you use these tools that you open source. Anemometer, for example, you probably used a lot at the beginning, but I don't know, maybe over time people are using it less, doing other things, and how that sort of changes your relationship to and maintenance of those tools.
Sure. The question was regarding our evolution of using the tools, of using it very heavily early on versus tapering off recently. That is somewhat true. I think one of the biggest problems that we have had in terms of adoption of the tools internally is employee turnover or new hires not realizing the tools that are available to them. We've gone through methods recently to try and educate and show how robust the tools can be. Very specifically, we've used it just today to investigate some issues with bad query plans that made themselves into production or had changed, but we were still forcing a bad index and things. We were able to look into that, and specifically looking at the next round of anemometer collections and saying, this is the old query, this is the sum of all the lock time, or whatever specific aspect you're looking at it, and then this is the new checksums that were created when the query changed, and then you can specifically look at that and say, there is a big difference in terms of usage from whether it's time running or what have you. So I would say when the product spun up and ran, yes, it was very much, hey, this is awesome. We're going to completely review everything that we've done. This is really easy. And then once you kind of get rid of a lot of the demons, I guess, that's in your environment, it's a little less important. But it's definitely still something that is used and relevant. Anybody else? Back to you.
Another one on RainGauge specifically. So RainGauge works with PT stock.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I'm just curious how creating that works off an existing tool, whether there's been any sort of evolution on there as have people made bug reports to PT stock to help it work better with RainGauge or.
I'm actually going to pass this one off to Alex because he recently filed an issue related to PT stock and some of the issues we've had in RainGauge.
Yeah, we made a mistake including our own PT stock version into the repo, and there was a bug in PT stock which was fixed in upstream, and it wasn't fixed in our version of PT stock. So yeah, I did file the bug about that. So lesson from that is rely on upstream and do not copy if it's not necessary.
Yeah, I think that plays nicely into the slide about including spec files and things for your building. You can specifically say, this requires the Percona toolkit, greater than whatever the minimum version is that it has PT stock. And that way, instead of copying the code in-house, you're kind of putting it up to the outside contributions to the actual tool that you're using, rather than, in this case, copying all the files and then hoping that you don't have a major problem, which unfortunately we did. All right, I think we got 4 minutes. If anybody else, we'll take one more question. Or no questions if there aren't any. All right, cool. So that concludes everything. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We have Twitter handles if anybody wants to get in contact with us. We'd love to answer any questions out of band. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great one last session.